Begin with gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The total cost of all regulations on the books amounted to a little more than $1.9 trillion in 2021. This means that if the U.S. regulatory state was its own country, it would have the 8th highest GDP in the world. Think about that. Not surprisingly, Joe Biden is the greatest regulator in history. In his first year in office, he oversaw regulatory burdens that was 4 times as great as Obama in his first year in office. Biden's regulations have sought to eliminate combustion engines, gas stoves, fossil fuel power plants. However, a less conspicuous area of regulatory overreach is Biden's war on critical minerals. In January of this year, Biden's Interior Department canceled copper mine leases held by Twin Metals in northern Minnesota due to regulatory violations, even though the leases were previously renewed by the Trump administrations. A few days later, Biden's EPA cited a seldom-used section of the Clean Water Act to kill the Pebble Mine in Alaska, abandoning extractions of one of the largest deposits of copper and gold because they said it would harm salmon populations. Pebble Mine, for example, contains an estimated $400 billion worth of critical minerals, which are essential to our economy and our R&D. Just think about how many jobs were lost and the livelihoods affected. Resolution Copper, a mine near Superior, Arizona, some of whose regulatory hurdles I have been instrumental in overcoming through legislative action in 2015, continues to remain idle as its managers wade through regulation barrier after regulatory barrier. Another impact of crushing regulation, ironically, is an over-reliance on under-regulated mines in third world countries, infamous for human rights violations and environmental degradation. While the EPA worries about the potential problems with salmon in Alaska, unregulated gold mining in the third world poisons 15 million people. We desperately need to rein in regulations instead of continuing to let them barrel out of control. To that end, Trump's executive order, eliminating 2 regulations for every one, is a policy approach that I admire. The dirty truth is that lobbyists who represent big businesses love regulations, as they destroy the competition which does not have the resources and lawyers to comply. In fact, the military is a great example of that. Congress has a duty to protect small businesses who are the backbone of the economy, as they are job creators, by curtailing the state. Now, questions. Mr. Campow, in your testimony, the President Trump's policy to remove 2 rules for every 1 rule added was actually not as impactful as requiring each agency to have a regulatory budget. Could you please go into that a little bit more?
Thank you, Congressman. The point that I was making there was that the regulatory budget is often known by the shorthand phrases like 2 for 1 or 1 in, 2 out. And I just wanted to note that it was in fact an instrument in service of the regulatory, of the what I consider to be the sort of core regulatory budget, which was in the first year, in 2017, a $0 cap on new regulatory activity, and then in the out years, a number to be determined by the administrator of OIRA in collaboration with the agencies in a ground-up process. And so that budget, so there was some criticism around the 2 for 1. Well, what constituted an out, what constituted an in? And what I said was that there was some flexibility in the ins and outs calculations, which was clearly articulated in the guidance that implemented the order, but the core of the budget, which was the dollar aspect of it, was I think pretty much not criticized, and was the total savings over the course of the 4 years was just under $200 billion on net across the entire federal government.
That's incredible. So, Mr. White, coming back to you. So part of the testimony was about implementation and enforcement. So now at least 1/3 of our budget is associated with health care. So there was a rule passed, that was one of the last bills signed by President Trump, about excluding the Sherman and Clayton antitrust exemption for medical insurance industries. Would there be some reason why you would feel that the Department of Justice would not enforce that?
Thank you, Congressman. I'm very sorry to say I'm not familiar with that particular legal provision. Let me say more generally that given the sheer number of regulations currently on the books, in addition to all the statutes, agencies have enormous enforcement discretion. which can then be leveraged or at the very least creates a lot of uncertainty.
And quickly getting to that point,
Yeah.
Congress can dictate in their appropriations more specifically where the money can be spent. Is that one of the regulatory controls as well as the reauthorization of those programs?
Yes, it can be and it should be. Congress's power of the purse is one of the most important tools it has for the sake of good policymaking and good enforcement. And anything Congress can do to improve its use of that tool, I think, would be a good thing.
Thank you very much.
Chair now recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes.